Hey everyone, Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the 29th episode of the Writ Podcast. It's been a big week here in Ottawa, and of course the biggest news is the ouster of Erin O'Toole as leader of the Conservative Party. The Conservative caucus put O'Toole's leadership to a vote, and he lost pretty badly, 73 to 45. That makes him the first leader to be removed as a result of the Reform Act, which empowers MPs to do something just like this. There's lots to go over about how the Conservative Party got here and what comes next. So to help me work through it, I'm joined again today by the CBC's Erin Wherry. Hey, Erin.
Hey, Eric.
So, yeah, it's been a bit of a week because I'm not sure if even a week or two ago we were really counting the days of Erin O'Toole's leadership to be as short as they were. It does seem like this came together all really quickly.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. Like if you'd asked me on election night last fall, do you think Erin O'Toole is going to survive as Conservative leader? I might have said, I don't think his chances are very good. But if you'd asked me last week whether Erin O'Toole would be out within a week, I would have been shocked. It feels from the outside like there was kind of this long simmering tension, and whether it was the convoy or some other aspect of this finally pushed things over the edge and led to this break. And of course, the other issue here is the Reform Act, right? Like in any other situation, this might have simmered for a long time or gone all the way to the party and had a membership vote. But because there was this kind of automatic trigger there and a number you could hit, I think that it feels like that gave the dissidents something to shoot for, and then sort of things just kind of unraveled from there.
It's surprising that it actually got to that because, I've heard lots of people say that the Reform Act is a nice thing, but it's not really needed because if you're getting to the point where you're going to lose one of those votes, you would normally get out of the way and avoid that. And a part of me expected that Erin O'Toole, if he didn't think he was going to win, would preemptively resign, because it's better to resign and hold up the notion that, if you would have stayed, we had the votes, but, we were still divided, so didn't want to. But he didn't just lose a bit. He lost by quite a bit, only to have 45 of his 118 voting MPs, because Scott Reid didn't vote because he was the chair of the committee. That's not good. And it's
good analysis, Eric.
Yes, thank you. Well, that's why I used to be paid the big bucks. But it does suggest that really miscalculated, really misunderstood his own support within his caucus.
Yeah, I had the same feeling too. Like after the news broke that there were whatever it was, 35 MPs, I thought, okay, well maybe, because I think that night there was sort of scuttlebutt that there was going to be a statement from O'Toole coming, and I thought, okay, so maybe he's going to resign. And then he didn't, and I thought, okay, well, give it a shot, I guess. But even up until yesterday morning, I thought, surely if this is bad for him, he's going to come out and say, he's going to come out and preempt this and say, well, I concede, I don't want to tear the party apart. We need to be united, and so I'll step aside for the better interest of the party. And so it either suggests that he's just like the bravest man alive and was willing to go in there and get defeated. He didn't know, or he didn't know what he was stepping into. But it also might suggest, it might also speak to just the breakdown between him and the caucus, that he didn't realize he was doomed before he stepped in there. And, Hannah Thibodeau was reporting yesterday, my colleague, your former colleague now, that he seemed to lose votes in the room with the way he addressed caucus. And, that just again speaks to, it seems like there's sort of two things here, right? One is the public O'Toole or OTooles, plural, and the vulnerability that created. But it also seems like there just was a real breakdown between him and the caucus and how he deals with MPs and how he dealt with caucus and his read of that room. Because like you say, if you know you're going to lose, or you should know that you're going to lose. And if you do know that you're going to lose, you probably shouldn't go all the way into the room and have it actually put down in numbers.
Yeah. And there was some, leaked stuff about what happened during the discussions. And it seems that Erin O'Toole, one of his pitches was, I'll change. I can adopt different policies. I can make, and I mean, this speaks to me the biggest problem with O'Toole. Now, Erin O'Toole was not the only issue that cost the Conservatives the last election, but this notion of being a flip-flopper. When I had Dan Arnold on the podcast a few weeks ago, he said that was one of the things that didn't really score well for Erin O'Toole in focus groups. And we saw some reporting from MPs at the time who were, the vote hadn't happened yet. They were talking anonymously, saying that he was someone who kept on going back and forth. And even on the Convoy, he went back and forth on his support or his opposition to it. So to go to that meeting, and maybe there were still some undecided MPs at the time, and to say, tell me what to do, and I'll do it. It must have confirmed for some of them, at least, that this is how it's always going to be.
Yeah, it is kind of remarkable that he does, the tale of his time as leader seems to be a lot of like, sort of just tell me what you want me to say and I'll say it. And so there's something comedic in the fact that he went down sort of pleading with people, like, just, I'll take whatever position you need me to take kind of thing. But I do think, and I'm sure this is what Dan Arnold was picking up, I do wonder whether he was sort of fundamentally broken as a political figure at this point. Like the idea that he'd been one thing and then was another, and I think even flipped back to the Conservative leadership era, O'Toole, after the election to try to prop himself up. Like, I don't know I think the public, a lot of times we sort of say, well, the public doesn't really pay attention to politics. They don't pay attention to this stuff. They don't get lost in it. It doesn't really matter. But I think the public can pick up on the idea that you're not who you say you are, or you're willing to say whatever you need to say to different audiences to get people to vote for you. And I think that I'm not sure that O'Toole could have ever gotten over that. I also think there's a weird thing here where, the fact that O'Toole had kind of campaigned is one thing, campaigned to the right and then tried to come back to the center during the general election. I think there was an undercurrent in political commentary that, like, well, that's what politicians do, right? They play to the base and then they play to the wider electorate. But I think that the commentariat had sort of transpose that from the American situation, where it's much more common for political leaders to run to the right or the left and then come back for the primary, their party primary, and then come back to the center for the general election. I don't think there's really a history of people doing that in Canada. I don't know that that's really a common thing in Canadian politics for political leaders to run hard one way and then come back to a moderate position for the general election. And I think as much as people knew it was happening, I think they underestimated how much trouble that would cause. And for the first couple of weeks of the election campaign in the fall, it sort of seemed like maybe O'Toole, it wasn't going to be a problem. But in hindsight, it was sort of just a matter of time until somebody, put their finger on an issue that he had said one thing and now wanted to say another, and the whole thing unraveled. And with O'Toole, it was guns. And so, whatever the sort of the exact cause of his losing the vote yesterday, I do kind of wonder whether he was just fundamentally broken as a political leader, and it was never going to work for him because he had presented too many versions of himself.
One of the strongest arguments that you heard repeated about why they shouldn't replace O'Toole was that we can't keep doing this every time, which isn't a very strong endorsement of the person who's currently there. That it's just like, yeah, but we can't just keep changing every time. We got to stick with the, dance with the one you brought kind of thing. It didn't seem to be even the people who were saying, that he should stay. It had to do much more with, we need to focus on the Liberals. We need to not go through this again, which I guess in the end, if a lot of those MPs might have looked around the room or the virtual room and say, well, my colleagues aren't on board with this anymore at this stage, this is not going to go away. I guess they felt like at that point, this isn't going to get any better, and just changing him for someone else isn't necessarily going to be the solution, but sticking with him for the sake of sticking with him is no longer an answer.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Like, yeah, you're right. You shouldn't, ideally they wouldn't be flipping leaders every time, but you can't, you can't just go, well, look, we shouldn't be switching leaders, so we'll stick with this guy. And the other part of it is that even if it had just been 35 MPs, just 35 MPs who opposed him, I don't think that was survivable. Like, even if the other, whatever it was, 70 odd MPs had voted with him, I don't know how he limps along with a quarter of his caucus or a third of his caucus being against him. I just don't. I think that's untenable, and I can imagine that once the 35 came out, I guess it worked out to be another 35 or so sort of looked around and went, well, it's over. We gotta find somebody else now, because it just, as soon as those 35 went public, I think it was kind of over for O'Toole.
And with the statement that he put out the night before, more or less indicating that if he won by a vote or two, he could still try to stick around. That probably didn't help things either, right? There must have been.
No, and it probably also didn't.
Yeah.
I mean, it probably also didn't help that his office went out and spun, oh, well, the people who are against him are just against him because they don't want to vote against conversion therapy. Which again, like, nuking your own party to save yourself, again, isn't going to work. The whole thing just it collapsed, but it may have been a house of cards to begin with, and it just took one. Sooner or later, this was going to happen.
Yeah, it was pretty spectacular in a way. When I heard the number, I was really surprised. I thought that he was probably going to lose the vote, but that it would be like relatively close. But this wasn't really very close at all. But because it was such a significant portion of the caucus that decided not to support him, I don't think all of those people are those on the right of the party. It's almost too big. That one of the reports said that roughly half of the Quebec MPs, could have been 4 or 5 out of the 10, did end up voting against him. So, those Quebec MPs are not those that are, the most to the right. They're mostly the ones that are to the center of the party, or the left of the Conservative Party itself. So it does show that there were some people who were coming from both sides that decided that this was done. But I still do think about what this means for the divisions within the party, because the biggest problem for him, for a lot of conservatives, was his decision to have a, quote unquote, carbon tax, to do the anti-conversion therapy bill that they allowed the Liberals to rush through or pass through in December. So there was that aspect to it. And a lot of the people who seem to be supporting him were primarily those who are on the center of the party, the moderates, who wanted to have more of a centrist approach. There was a Joël Godin, who's a Quebec MP. I saw him quoted in Le Devoir saying that if the party goes too far to the right, he might have to leave. He might have to sit as an independent. He might have to cross the floor or start his own party. Can the Conservatives get through this as one party?
It isn't, like, I think all things considered, there's every incentive for them to stick together, right? Like, they'll look around and go, well, if we break into, like, our chances that either of us, like, that even my side's going to break, that's going to form power is limited. So it's better for us to stick together and try to figure out a way to make this work. But I do wonder how, depending on where things go from here and who leads the party, whether everybody's going to be able to be on board with whatever they do. On carbon pricing, for instance, if they decide, no, we're against carbon pricing, we're not doing it, can the people who want a moderate centrist party stay with it? Conversely, if they say, yeah, the party leader says, okay, we are going to do carbon pricing, do they lose the people who are absolutely against it? I don't know what the identity of that party is that they can all hold together. And I don't know whether they can all feel comfortable being in that party. Like, it is, it's a party that's split up before, so it's definitely possible. I wouldn't say it's the likeliest outcome, but it doesn't feel impossible.
One thing I've been wondering, there's been a lot of talk about how Stephen Harper kept this coalition together and was able to win elections. But, Stephen Harper became leader of the Conservative Party 18 years ago. And the last election that he won as leader of the party was 10 years ago. I wonder if that coalition was easier to hold together because more people were there at the time. Would the Harper coalition be big enough today to win an election? I wonder if things have shifted, because on a lot of these issues, on the social conservative issues, this was still a pretty divisive issue when gay marriage was passed in, I think it was 2004, 2005. Now it's pretty much a settled thing. So in the Harper era, having social conservatives within the party might have been a thing where a lot of people could say, well, we respect their views, we disagree with them, but this is a place where we can still debate. But now I wonder if on some of these issues, it's moved so much that it's no longer really a big tent, because for a lot of Canadians, they might look at people who are in the tent and say, like, I don't want to be in this tent. Because of who's in it. And you can just look at what happened with the Convoy, right? There's a lot of people who would say that a lot of people are there for, principle, and they're not there to ruin people's lives. They're not racist, all that kind of thing. But if you're including some awful people within your tent, some people don't want to be in that tent anymore. And I wonder if the party has changed. The times have changed, but the party hasn't changed enough.
Yeah, that's interesting. Like, my hunch with Harper would be that he was able to hold that party together. He was able to get the party together and then hold it together because they'd been out of power for a decade, and getting back into power and having power were such incentives that it took precedence over everything else. So even if there were differences, even if social conservatives didn't love the things Harper was doing all the time, the threat of losing power or not being able to get into power was enough to keep them together. And that then when 2015 came along and they were out of power, suddenly it was, okay, now that we're out of power, it's a chance for everyone to go, okay, well, what should this party be and how should it be represented? And what differences have we papered over for the last 9 years that we now want to reassess, and opinions that we want to express. The other thing I would wonder about is, Harper flirted with acting on climate change, but for the most part, he punted it down the road. And in hindsight, by punting it down the road, he may have created more problems for the party going in the long term. But I wonder whether he avoided some problems at the time. And by not tackling emissions from the oil and gas industry, by by not putting a price on carbon, whether he gingerly stepped around a bunch of things that now the party can't figure out how to deal with, and whether that has changed the calculus significantly for the Conservatives. Like in 2015, like I sort of spend a lot of time writing on climate, so maybe I'm fixated on this issue particularly. But in 2015, the thought was, well, carbon pricing is a loser. Acting on climate change is really hard politically. And it really feels like in the space of 7 years, that's flipped. And now carbon pricing is a mark of being serious about climate change, and the public wants you to act on climate change. And the Conservatives, one of the possible downsides writ large from the Erin O'Toole era is whether he has poisoned the chalice on carbon pricing in the Conservative Party by sort of bait and switching the party and seeming to backtrack on his own position. And not ever kind of having a moment where he went to the party and said, Erin O'Toole, political commentators like me sometimes put too much stock in speeches, but Erin O'Toole could have gone to the party and said, look, I understand we have opposed carbon pricing in the loudest possible terms for a decade now. And I understand why we did that. But we have to face up to the reality of the situation, and we have to take this issue seriously. And here's why we need to have a price on carbon, and here's why it's better than the alternatives. But he never did that. He just sort of went, we oppose Justin Trudeau's carbon tax, and then one day was like, oh, and here's our own carbon tax. And there's a potential downside here where he's going to end up where the Conservative Party will end up being even more opposed to carbon pricing than it was before. And that will, both make the debate harder in Canada, but around climate action, but will also make it harder for conservatives to get elected. And so like to your point about like whether the Harper era was sort of an anomaly, I do think, I don't know whether it was an anomaly, but it does feel like we're in a different world now, and conservatives haven't quite figured out how their party works in this new world.
Well, Michael Chong, when he ran in 2017 and he was talking about carbon pricing, he would be booed by conservative members. I don't think he would get a better reception today if he runs and has a carbon pricing position. I'm not sure if he's still going to avoid boos.
No, I was thinking about that exact scenario too, because I was like, maybe Michael Chong runs again because he feels that carbon pricing needs to be represented in a leadership debate. And then I was thinking about the same scene that you mentioned, like, okay, so if he stood on a debate stage tomorrow and said, conservatives need to implement a carbon tax, what would the reaction be? And I was thinking about it, and I'm like, I feel like a bunch of candidates on stage would laugh at him and he'd be booed. And that's a tough spot for both the climate debate and the Conservative Party.
You can already kind of see the rejoinder. We tried running as Liberal Light in 2021, and look what happened. So that'll be one of the little kind of debates within the leadership race that'll be interesting to watch to see what the party's going to do. I guess the question is how much of a debate they're really going to have, right? Because we've already seen some of the people talking about having a relatively short race that would end sometime in the fall, or have a leader probably to be there when Parliament returns in the fall after the summer break, which probably means not a huge amount of time to sign up new members. So you're probably talking to mostly the existing base that elected Erin O'Toole just 2 years ago. What kind of debate is really going to happen over the next, let's say, 6 months, on these issues?
Yeah. It feels like we went through a period where everybody thought having long leadership campaigns was the ideal, right? Like, we really should have a long debate and we should test these candidates. And I feel like the conventional wisdom started to flip over the last few years, where it was like, long campaigns might be good for Eric Grenier, but they're not necessarily good for the party. And
those are that's an important consideration. I don't know.
We're courting the Eric Grenier constituency, but are we losing the rest? So I would think the Conservatives would aim to have this wrapped up before the end of the year. In particular, because we're in a minority situation, and I don't know that they necessarily want to be sitting around without a leader for too long. I mean, I think it is possible to still have debates within a short campaign. My question would be whether, does someone like Pierre Poilievre come charging out of the gates, and the sort of non-Pierre corners of the party don't really have an alternative to suggest, and Poilievre or someone like that kind of wins it in a walk. Like, is there going to be a real fight here, or is a prohibitive favorite going to come out quick and sort of win this before anybody really gets to even have a contest?
To be fair, we did think that was what was going to happen in 2020 with Peter MacKay, right? So,
right.
And I don't think he won. So we could have the same kind of scenario, right, where it is Pierre Poilievre. Everyone's like, well, it's obviously going to be him, and then someone else, comes up from behind and ends up winning in it because they can somehow overturn sort of the narrative. And so that brings me to the last point that I want to try to discuss a little bit, is that what paths are there, right? Is there going to be a quote unquote red Tory candidate running this time? Will one bother to run? Peter MacKay got a pretty rough go, and he wasn't even that much of a red Tory. He had a sort of reputation as a red Tory, but not really a record that backed that up. But he was trying to represent that wing of the party. Will one run this time? Because they haven't had a lot of success.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Like, to me, the first thing I'm most interested in is there going to be a debate about the convoy? Are we going to have a kind of convoy candidate and a non-convoy candidate? Are people willing to challenge that? Is someone willing to come out of the woodwork and say, I don't think we should be aligned with this. Is there going to be a debate about that? Or is it just going to be sort of a kind of constellation of convoy candidates? So I think that's kind of the first sort of point of difference I'm interested to see. And then, can there be a moderate candidate? Like, part of me thinks there has to be, like, someone in that side of the party will say, well, somebody's got to be the standard bearer here. But then the question becomes, like, does that person get much of a hearing? Or are they Michael Chong of 2017, where, he wasn't completely wiped out. Like, he didn't finish last, but he certainly wasn't considered a front runner by the end of the campaign. I like it, and I guess I don't know whether the default, the split in this party is necessarily between hard right and moderate. But for the kind of big picture political scene, that's sort of the question: are you going to get a hard right candidate, or are you going to get a moderate winner? And I just don't know how interested the party is in having that debate, or whether the party has sort of decided, no, we want to go back and be we actually did want the guy that we voted for in 2020 or whatever it was. We do want the true blue conservative who's going to take on the radical right and take back Canada. And that's the guy we want. So whoever says that this time, that's what we'll pick.
It does. Yeah. I mean, it seems the obvious thing. The candidate profile who won in 2020 is probably the favorite to win this time. There's no real reason to expect it'll be any different. I think that the 2020 race, because there was 4 candidates, in a way, I think it did kind of show where the wings are, right? You have someone who is trying to run as the moderate candidate, someone who's trying to run as more or less the populist, conservative candidate. That would be Erin O'Toole in the last one. You have someone who's running as a social conservative candidate. That was Leslie Lewis. And someone who's running as the kind of person who would be, all in with the Convoy, which would be a Derek Sloan kind of person. And if you have 10 candidates this time, they're all still fighting for that same kind of territory, right? And I think the challenge for the moderate candidate is that they can't get the support of the social conservative, and they can't get the support of the PPC kind of candidate. That tends to go to the populist kind of person running. And it seems just like an obvious sort of funneling of where that vote is going to end up going.
Yeah, like one thing, and this is where maybe they should take advice from you, Eric. Like, one thing that I'm interested in is whether they would go back and whether there will be a debate about what they should take away from the 2021 election result. Like, will they look at that result and say, as you mentioned earlier, well, look, we tried the moderate thing, it didn't work? Or will they because I don't think that's a fair read of those results. I don't think you can look at those results and say, well, the moderate thing doesn't work. Like, to me, there's a ton of noise in just O'Toole's own approach. But from my recollection of those results and what I've looked at, when I've looked at those results, it kind of looks like maybe O'Toole was sort of headed in the right direction, but couldn't quite close the deal. And so it would be interesting to see how they, if they look at those results and have a debate about them, and then what their takeaways are from it. Do they look at those results and go, well, we can afford to lose some votes in Alberta and Saskatchewan if we just win a few more votes in Ontario? Or do they look at those results, as you said, and say, well, we tried the moderate thing, it didn't work? Like, what would you, like, if you look at those results, do you see any big conclusions from them?
Well, for me, if you're looking at the moment when the Conservatives were leading the most, where they were the closest to winning, it was the point of the campaign where the Conservatives had a good big start. They were trying to run more or less as the moderate a party, not that far further to the right of the Liberals on a lot of issues. And that's when they were doing well in the polls. Again, just to go back to what Dan Arnold said a couple of weeks ago, that was when the party was doing well and the Liberals were worried. It was only when they brought in the contradiction on the gun laws, and then the vaccination stuff started to build up a little bit more, that it chipped away at the Conservative position as being a trustworthy centrist kind of party. So I think that if you do take the lesson that Liberal light didn't work, you're taking the wrong lesson. What didn't work was the inauthenticity, the flip-flop on policy. It's sort of the same kind of playbook that the Liberals have always had with the Conservatives, is that no, you can't trust them. They're actually for the right. But if you give voters a reason to believe that, then I think that's really damaging for the Conservatives. And there'll be people will say, well, they won the popular vote and all that kind of stuff, and it's true. But they really, I know it is a cliched, and you mentioned it. They don't need all those votes in Alberta and Saskatchewan. If the Liberals are still getting 40% of the vote in Ontario, they're still winning the plurality of the vote in Quebec, you're not going to win an election. It's just that's just the math. And if the Conservatives are not competitive in Ontario, if they're only getting 35%, that's not good enough. Doesn't matter if they're getting 70% in Saskatchewan. While they might be winning the national popular vote, it's just not how elections are decided here. And the Liberals have figured that out. And the Conservatives seem to not want to figure that out.
Or they seem to want to hold on to their sort of base and just hope that eventually, sooner or later, the Ontario vote will come enough to them that they can claim some kind of victory. And I don't know, when I look at the Conservative Party post, the modern Conservative Party history, the sort of post 2003 history, I think you can read the results really two different ways. One, you can look at them and go, well, they've really established themselves as a permanent fixture in the party and in the country, and they're competitive and they can win elections. The other way to look at it is they've never broken 40. They've lost more than they've won. Is that really is 39% their ceiling, and that's what they should hope for? And they should hope to win sort of 3 out of every sort of 9 or 8 elections, or is there a way to kind of get over 40 and be a more dominant party in the future? And I don't it. It still seems to me like they're taught, the Conservative Party might be aiming only as high as 39, and that's sort of it. And I don't know, maybe that's the better long-term play for them. But it feels like there's a conversation for the Conservative Party to have here, where they go, okay, what would it look like for us to get to 45, or at least have that in our universe of possibilities? I just don't know that they're yet sort of shooting for that. It still feels like they're trying to kind of win the math of, well, look, if we can just get to 39 and the Liberals can fall back a bit, that's enough for us and we'll win. Now, granted, I think in the future there will be questions about whether Conservatives having a more minority in Parliament is enough for them to hold power. But I do wonder whether Conservatives are aiming high enough, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, the Liberals, they benefited from a desire for change in 2015 and 2 not very strong opposition leaders in the last 2 elections. The Conservatives had exactly the same kind of thing, right? 2006, desire change, sponsorship scandal, and then they had 2 weak opposition leaders in Stéphane Dion and Michael Ignatieff. So, it is hard to take kind of broader lessons about this when a lot of it is just based on what the other party's doing. Because if you look at what the Conservative vote share is, as a share of all voters, it's almost been constant in all of these elections. One of the reasons they won the majority in 2011 was that the Liberal vote just stayed home. And I think that's one of the challenges there too, is that getting to 39% for them in that election, a little bit more than 39%, required the turnout to be quite low. And that's a different kind of strategy that you're playing when you're trying to hope that the other guys' votes stay home, rather than trying to increase the size of your base, which is a way to win an election. But it's better if you have, I guess, both options on the table, that the turnout will be low for your opponents and turnout will be high for you.
I mean, the other factor here, and I don't know it's really something that Conservatives can think about, but I think it's something for the wider conversation and for the rest of the electorate to consider, is that, look, the next Conservative leader is going to face a government that's in its 8th or 9th year, might have changed prime ministers by then. The longer the Liberals are in government, the conceivably the greater the chances become that somebody else is going to win the next election. And so, for all the talk about where the Conservatives should go, it's possible that the next Conservative leader will just be the guy or woman who's lucky enough to be sitting in that spot when the Canadian public decides to change leaders. But I think so. Look, this may all be moot. But I do think there is a long-term conversation for this party to have about where it's going and what its ceiling looks like. I don't know why. I do think that the political environment is more competitive now than it's been maybe in Canadian history. There's more parties that are more capable of winning votes. But I do kind of wonder whether the Conservatives have ended up in a place where figuring out whether they're content to kind of be a party of 39% as the ceiling, or whether there's a situation out there where winning 45% is a possibility.
Yeah, and the idea of timing being everything could have a big influence on who decides to run this time, right? Because I think the argument is, if it's not this one, the next one might be, in a while, right? Because the next person who wins the leadership has a decent shot of becoming the prime minister. And so, unless you're in your 30s or 40s, this might be it. So we'll see if we get some good candidates, because the last two leadership races, Peter MacKay was seen as one of these big leading lights within the party. But if you look at the entire field of candidates in 2017 and 2020, there wasn't the Brad Wall, there wasn't the Jean Charest, there wasn't the Ron Ambrose, there wasn't all of these, people who were seen as obvious front runners, obvious next leaders. We haven't had that kind of profile. So we'll see if it ends up being one that is just very quick. Someone like Poilievre just gets to walk, or if we get, a competitive race with an interesting field of candidates. And, anybody who's watching politics is hoping that it'll be an interesting field of candidates and a competitive race.
Yeah. Last time's race was almost defined more by the fact that we spent like 2 months speculating about a dozen different candidates who all declined to run. And then, it came down to O'Toole and MacKay, and it was not the race we all thought we were going to get. This time we may get that race. I mean, I do think one way or another, this is a massive race for the party and a very interesting race for the country, given the times, given the situation. The direction this party takes is going to be both fascinating and important.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast to talk to me about it again, Erin. And I'm sure we'll have lots to talk about in the next, 6-8 months, maybe at least. We'll see.
Yeah, something like that. Good to talk to you, Eric.
Thanks again to Erin Wherry for coming on the podcast, and that'll be it for this episode. Clearly, this political year has gotten a lot more interesting now that we have a Conservative leadership race again. So if you aren't already a subscriber of the Writ.ca, I hope you'll head over to the website and consider subscribing. I'll have lots of coverage of this race, along with the upcoming provincial elections in Ontario and Quebec. Also, just wanted to flag that on Saturday, the BC Liberal Party will be choosing its next leader. There are 7 candidates in the running, though nearly half of the caucus has gotten behind Kevin Falcon, who came second to Christy Clark in the 2011 BC Liberal leadership race. Something to watch over the weekend. Okay, that's it for this week. Keep safe, and thanks for listening.